Good morning. Sometimes I get to thinking about certain hymns that we sing and what they mean. Um, and hymns are a tricky thing because while they're intended as worship to God, there's something that we perform and give up to God as service. They also communicate theology. Hymns teach us doctrine just as much as sermons do, perhaps more so, because I've never memorized any sermon that I heard, but I've memorized a lot of hymns. They are deeply internalized within me. I remember them. I've memorized more hymns than probably Bible verses. And that matters because a hymn with theology can do us a lot of good. But there are also hymns that we sing that don't have very good theology. And I think sometimes, are there hymns that we just shouldn't sing because of what they communicate? And I probably overthink it, but I think about it anyways. One of those songs for me is Troublesome Times Are Here. It's a song that I love musically. I love singing to it. But the tone of the song gives me a lot of pause because the song is about the judgment. And the song has this jovial and joyous tune to it. You guys know what I'm talking about. The way we sing, many will meet their doom. It sounds like a celebration, and it it hurts my conscience a little bit. It seems so at odds with the Christian compassion and the evangelistic concern that we're supposed to have. Should we really be singing a song that takes such a tone with the judgments of people? That's one example. Another hymn that I'm not sure I like very much is Mansion Over the Hilltop, which might surprise you. It's a classic. We sing that one a lot, or at least I have. And that's song 881 in our book, and the lyrics go a little something like this. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the ransom will shine, I want a gold one that silver lines. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop in that bright lands where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely. I'm not discouraged, I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city. I want a mansion, a robe and a crown. It's another song that I really like the tune to. It's really fun to sing. But I think, well, let me move back from that. The premise of this song at its core of receiving a mansion, a robe, and a crown, those are biblical. The mansion might be a little bit misleading. That term comes from the King James Version rendition of John 14:12, where Jesus is speaking forward to the expectation of heaven, and he says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." Now, the term there, mansion, is a little bit of a materialistic choice in translation because the word in the Greeks is simply a place. That's all the word means. And for that reason, most of your modern translations that you are probably reading out of are going to use less specific words like dwelling place or room. And I do worry that the choice of mansion there in that verse has led to a little bit of a distorted view of heaven, where part of people, part of what people are looking forward to, has to do with material wealth instead of looking forward to the presence of God, instead of looking forward to peace and purity, and instead of looking forward to a restored harmony with God and with our fellow man. Now, the idea of receiving a robe in that song, that comes from a couple places, such as from the messianic prophecy in Isaiah 61, 10, which I won't read, but it's a verse that presents the idea of a marriage between God and his people, which seems like a very deliberate foreshadowing of the marriage of Jesus to his church. And it also comes from the book of Revelation, such as in chapter 6, where the martyrs are given white robes by God until justice is fulfilled for them. I see the robes in that hymn I sang, but I don't see any hints of martyrdom there. Now, the last one, the crown, is the most important one, or at least it's the one the Bible talks about the most. It's found repetitively in the New Testament, too many times for me to want to cover them all today. But the crown represents the honor that we will receive in heaven for being faithful Christians when we reach it, as expressed in verses like 1 Peter 5:4, which says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." Now, the problem I have with the way the song speaks about the crown is the same problem I have with the emphasis on receiving a mansion. The idea that the song seems to express is I might not have quite as much silver or gold as I would like to have in this life. I might only have a little cottage to live in, but I guess I can put up with that for a little while because God's going to make me wealthy in heaven. That's really what I want. I want a mansion, a robe, and a crown. And for me, heaven is just a matter of deferred gratification for me to wait until I get what I want. And I just don't really like the tone of that. I'm not sure the tone is very Christian. I'm not sure that's the best motivation. Um, and I don't see a lot of Christ and his example in it. It's so at odds to me with the central words that Jesus speaks, that he who wishes to keep his life must lose it, that he who is greatest in the kingdom is he who puts himself last, that even the king of the kingdom has no place to rest his head, and his followers must be able to leave father and mother and accept the same. And when I read the scriptures, which speak of the crown which we are to receive, I just simply don't see the materialism and joviality that I see in the hymn. Yeah, we're going to receive a reward in heaven and it's going to be great. I'm just not sure that the motivation with how we get that is correctly expressed in the hymn. If you turn to a couple verses with me, maybe turn to these ones. The first one's going to be in James chapter 1, verse 12. This is one of the verses where the idea of a crown comes from. And I think this one is important. James 1:12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Another verse about the crown that I want to read is in 2 Timothy 4:8. It talks about the crown in a very similar vein. 2 Timothy 4:8 says, "Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Now, between those two verses, there's two things that really stand out to me. Um, First of all, I think it's quite clear that the crown does not symbolize wealth. It's not a crown that is given any descriptions of material or beautiful qualities in these verses. The crown we will receive, according to the text, is a crown of righteousness and a crown of life. I think it's pretty clear that that's not a literal thing, it's representative. The crown represents the life and the righteousness that we receive from God as a reward and as a natural consequence of following after Christ. And there's one other verse that really drives that idea home for me, and that is Revelation 4:10 through 11, which is the first chapter of John's vision of heaven. And he sees many things in heaven, and one of the things he sees is this. I apologize. I know I'm moving through these verses fast. Revelation 4, verses 10 through 11. "The 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, 'Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.'" The 24 elders' reaction to the crown they receive is this: they view it not as something to be possessed and retained, but rather something to lay back down at the feet of God in sacrifice and reverence. Now, there's a possible reaction to that, which is to say, well, that's 24 elders in a particular vision, but where's the command that I'm going to do the same thing in heaven? The thing is, though, you are the 24 elders. What does that mean? Why are there 24 elders? Well, 24 is twice 12. The picture there is that it represents the grafting together of the 12 tribes of Israel and the church of the 12 apostles, all together into a single unified people of God. The 24 elders are a symbol for the collective of God's redeemed people throughout all of time. And God's people, the message is, are going to be so thankful when they get to heaven that our response is going to be to lay down our reward at Jesus' feet. And again, I don't think it makes sense that that is, a material reward. It's not gold and wealth. God doesn't want gold and wealth. The crown represents the life and the righteousness, according to those earlier verses, that being part of the body of Christ gives us. And at the end of all things, we recognize God as the source of all life and righteousness, and we will want to return it all to God's feet as the creator and the master of everything good that we ever had. But there's more to it than that, I think. There's also the matter, excuse me, of the way that we seek that crown. And it's not, as the hymn suggests, by biding our time in a little cottage until we get upgraded to a mansion. Did you notice what James 1:12 said about how we inherit that crown? James 1:12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life." We receive our crown, according to James, by remaining steadfast under trial, by standing the test. So the Bible here isn't contrasting the crown to poverty in life. The Bible is contrasting the crown to the purifying suffering that we have to go through in life. And Revelation does the exact same thing in its picture of heaven by granting the robe to the martyrs waiting for justice. But more important than this, I think, is looking to our chief example. So looking how Christ himself sought his crown, because Christ did seek a crown. To be a Christian in the true sense is to be like Christ. That's what the word means. It means little Christ. And in seeking a crown, we have good precedents. Christ sought a crown for himself, but it wasn't a crown of gold. It wasn't a crown of wealth. His crown was something that looks nothing like what I'm envisioning in the song Mansion Over the Hilltop. I think you know what I'm talking about. Philippians 2:5-8 says of Jesus, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped." There's that idea of releasing possession again. "But he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." From the beginning, Jesus actually had a crown. Again, not in the literal sense, but in the sense of his honor and authority. He had equality with God. And yet, Jesus did not count that crown as something to be grasped, or rather, he sought another crown. And that crown was the one that he obtains in Mark chapter 15, verses 16-20. "And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him." This part of the story is the central oddity and irony of the Gospels, that Jesus came legitimately revealing himself to be the Messiah, revealing himself to be God, revealing himself to be the only one who is ever worthy of the ultimate authority and glory. And yet, at the pinnacle of his revelation, when the people all knew who he was, when the people finally expected him to take action and take the throne, he cast all of it aside and he took suffering and death instead. And this is what the word Christ has become to mean. It's easy for us to forget that that's not what people always thought about when they heard the word Christ. Translated literally, Christ means anointed one. The very word expresses an expectation that the Christ, when he came, would be anointed with wealth and authority and honor. But instead, he chose to be anointed with nakedness and thorns and blood. The hymns that we sing express a desire for a crown, but I'm not sure I've heard many that express desire for a crown of thorns. And more pertinently, most of the time, our lives just really do not suggest a desire for that crown of thorns. We want the payoff of being a Christian, a little Christ, without ever actually being a little Christ in the first place. In Matthew 16, verses 24 through 27, Jesus made this expectation of emulation clear. He told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done." Now, of course, there is a noted contrast in Jesus' teachings, which I'm thankful to not forget. There's a contrast between his high standards for how people are to follow after him. And there's also a grace that God shows to those who very feebly and insufficiently try to follow after Jesus. That contrast is possible because of the kindness of God. God calls his people to great things, yet he also has mercy on them when they don't measure up to the example. But that kindness of God, I think, often gets minimized and made common because people aren't really honest about how much Jesus asks of them, how difficult the calling of being a Christian is. Now, all the same, the expectation of Jesus' teaching is that the life of a Christian is supposed to be fundamentally different from the ways of the world because we are following after the example of what Christ did and how he lived his life. But are our lives really differentiated from the world in any way? Is there anyone who really lives even a fraction of what Jesus did? Now, the restoration movements of Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, the tradition that we consider ourselves to be a part of today, did a lot of good things in transforming the modern church and calling people to seek out the will of God, untangled from the human rules that were added over time and different aspects of false religion. And I don't wish to speak any ill of what these men did because I'm convinced of the goodness of what they taught. You know, that they preached a return to the church that Jesus established. They spoke a rejection of rules which were constructed by men and falsified as being God ordained. They taught the Bible to common men and taught them to use the terminology that the Bible itself used. And they instructed people to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent. But I think if there is one inadequacy of the restoration movement as we know it, it's that it focused much on the organization of the church as a whole and focused less on the restoration of individual souls. Because when we read the New Testament, Jesus doesn't actually have a lot to say about the organization of the church. He talks about the organization of the individual first. The things about the organization of the church, how we do things, comes later in the teachings of the apostles, and they're important, but it's secondary to what Christ expects us to transform in ourselves first. Now, we call the Barton Stone movement the Restoration Movement, but it's far from being the only restoration movement in the history of the church. There have been many times of restoration, and there have been many restorers. One of my favorite restorers is a man named Soren Kierkegaard, who I talk about often. Kierkegaard was reacting against many of the same hypocrisies that he saw, not in the American churches, but in the Danish church in his time. He talked about a lot of the same false teachings and man made additions and unbiblical institutions that Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone were discussing. However, Kierkegaard was a little distinct in that he was concerned less with restoring the structure of the church and a little more interested in restoring the soul of the Christian itself. Kierkegaard, in a lot of ways, really lived in a similar world with a very similar church that we do today. Kierkegaard lived in Denmark in the 1800s, the principal heir to the religious transformation that was started by Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Denmark at that time was officially Lutheran. They prided themselves as the home of Christianity restored and the fully embodied purification that Martin Luther had brought to the church. And yet, on the individual level, very little, in Kierkegaard's estimation at least, of what the Danes did resembled Christ. They built great wealth for themselves, they exercised rulership over their neighbors through state mandated religion and government control, and they sought glory ultimately for the nation and for themselves. Towards the end of his life, Kierkegaard felt that he couldn't keep his silence any longer about the state of the church. And he had a lot of words to say about the state of Christian life in his country and the abuse of Luther's legacy as a reformer when he had originally nailed up those 95 criticisms of the unbiblical practices of the church. And while many of his words are very intense, emotional, and pessimistic, they're words that I consider often because I think they highlight an important contrast between the life Jesus calls us to and the life that most of the time Christians end up living instead. And part of this, Christian Kierkegaard laments, "O Luther, you had 95 theses. Terrible. And yet, in a deeper sense, the more theses, the less terrible. The matter is far more terrible that there is only one thesis. The Christianity of the New Testament does not exist at all. The official Christianity here in this land barely relates itself to the true Christianity of the New Testament. This, I believe, is the untruth of which official Christianity is guilty. It does not uncompromisingly make clear the Christian requirements, perhaps because it is afraid that we would shudder to see the distance at which we are living, not to mention that our lives cannot, in the remotest way, be considered as striving in the direction of fulfilling the Christian requirements. Or to just take one example of what is indeed present everywhere in the Christianity of the New Testament. When Christianity requires for savings one's life eternally, and this, after all, is what we believe to attain as Christians, hating one's own life in this world, is there a single one of us whose life, even in the remotest manner, can be called even the weakest striving in this direction? Whereas there are in this country perhaps thousands of Christians who are not even aware that this requirement exists. Accordingly, we Christians, we live and love our lives in the altogether ordinary sense. If God by grace, nonetheless, is to assume us to be Christians, one thing must still be required, that we, by being scrupulously aware of the requirement, have a true conception of how infinitely the grace is that has been shown to us. Personally, I really admire that sort of honesty. It's not something that I hear often. I admire the honesty that Kierkegaard has in acknowledging that he doesn't measure up to the calling of Christ. I admire his honesty in acknowledging that grace is the only way that we can be redeemed as Christian. But Kierkegaard never uses grace as an excuse to lie about what God has really asked of him and how far he really is from being like Christ. I'm not as pessimistic as Kierkegaard is. I think things are not as bad as he made them out to be, but I feel convicted about that very often, that I'm not living a Christian life to the degree that Jesus really asks us to. It's a very difficult thing. But sometimes I'm confronted with the contrast when I hear hymns like Mansion Over a Hilltop that just seem to deal with it so casually. I think that old hymn not only neglects the truth of what it means to live a Christian life, but it demeans it by replacing it with cheap materialism. There is another song, though, that speaks of similar things and speaks of robes and crowns. And I think this one does it in a way which I think is much more honoring of verses like James 1, Revelation 6, and Matthew 16. This one is called He Knows What I Need, and the lyrics go like this: I asked for a robe, he gave me no robe to wear. I asked for a crown, he gave me a cross to bear. He knows what I need, yes, indeed, he knows what I need. I asked for myself, he shows me a friend in need. Oh, I must be fed, he gives me his words to read. He knows what I need, yes, indeed, he knows what I need. Oh, some happy day, I'll hear the trumpet sounds. I'm going away, oh, I will be heaven bound. He'll wipe away all my tears, he'll wipe all my tears away. To hear his well done, oh, that will be heaven to me. All the way from heaven's throne to a manger there alone, led to the cross, he came to suffer everything. He asked for a cup, but oh, what a bitter cup. He never complains, he murmured not a word. He knows what I need, yes, indeed, he knows what I need. When I hear that song, that's a song that makes me think of the example of Christ. That's a song that makes me remember what he did for me. And it's a song, I think, that better motivates me to at least weekly strive in the direction that God needs me to be striving. That message is yours today as we stand and sing.